I knew something felt off the moment we arrived at the Westbrook Country Club. The elegant Georgian-style building was lit up against the evening sky, making the whole place look like something out of a fairy tale. But fairy tales weren't real, and neither was the smile I'd plastered on my face. Golden balloons floated against the high ceiling, fresh white lilies perfumed the air, and the soft hum of a jazz quartet filled the luxurious banquet hall. My husband Tom's parents were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, and the entire Boston elite seemed to have turned out for the occasion. The Matthews family wasn't just wealthy, they were Massachusetts old money, the kind that spoke in hushed tones and judged in silence. I should have felt warmth being surrounded by family, but instead, there was a cold pit in my stomach. As we walked in hand, Tom's grip tightened, too tight. He smiled at everyone else, but not at me. That morning, he'd criticized the way I'd done my makeup, saying I looked cheap. I'd redone it 3 times until he gave a curt nod of approval. I kept telling myself it was just stress. After all, events like this could make anyone tense, right? "Stand up straight, Sarah," he whispered through clenched teeth as we approached his mother, Elizabeth. "And for God's sake, try to look happy." I had been quiet in the car. Lately, that had become a habit. Every time I spoke, Tom found a reason to criticize. My belly was already showing through the midnight blue maternity dress he'd selected for me last week. I felt heavy, not just physically, but emotionally. I was 6 months pregnant, and the sparkle in our marriage had dimmed long before the baby. Still, I showed up. I curled my hair, wore the new dress he picked for me, and tried to be the picture-perfect wife. For his family. "Sarah, darling." Elizabeth embraced me with the careful hug of someone afraid to wrinkle their Chanel suit. "You're positively glowing." "Thank you, Elizabeth." "The party is beautiful," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. "Well, 50 years doesn't happen every day," she said with practiced modesty. "Though I know you young people might not see marriage quite the same way these days." Tom laughed, a sound that once made my heart flutter, but now made me flinch slightly. "We're taking notes, Mother. Aren't we, Sarah?" I nodded, mute again. The evening crawled by. I drank water while everyone else sipped champagne. I sat while others danced. I smiled at the right moments and nodded at the appropriate times. Tom's college friends from Harvard reminisced about their glory days, barely acknowledging my presence. His sister Margaret kept touching my belly without asking, making predictions about whether the baby would have the Matthews chin or the Matthews eyes. "You must be ecstatic," Margaret's husband, David, said to me during a brief moment when Tom had gone to get another drink. "The Matthews family heir on the way." I forced a smile. "We're very excited." The truth was, I'd been excited. Until I realized the baby was becoming another way Tom tried to control me. "You shouldn't eat that," he'd say at dinner. "Too much sodium isn't good for the baby." "Maybe you shouldn't visit your sister this weekend," he'd insist. "What if something happens while I'm not there?" "I don't think you should keep working," he'd argued. "The stress isn't good for our child." One by one, the pieces of my independence were chipped away under the guise of concern. At the buffet table, I found a moment of relief when I ran into Jenna, Tom's cousin and the only person in his family I genuinely connected with. She was a pediatrician who worked in community health centers, the black sheep of the family who chose service over status. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her eyes filled with genuine concern. "I'm fine," I answered automatically. She gave me a look that said she didn't believe me. "You know, Sarah, my office is always open if you need to talk. About anything." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes and blinked them away quickly. "Just pregnancy hormones. You know how it is." But then, while we stood near the 5-tiered anniversary cake, it happened. I was talking with Tom's parents, trying to contribute to the conversation in a way that wouldn't annoy him. Richard, Tom's father, asked about how we were preparing for the baby. "Tom's been so busy at the firm," I said, keeping my tone light. "Though he did try to assemble the crib last weekend." It reminded me of when he tried to cook dinner for me in the early days and nearly burned down our Cambridge apartment. I meant it as a harmless joke, something to make his parents laugh, to show them the charming side of their son I'd fallen in love with. Instead, Tom's hand suddenly gripped my wrist, hard enough that I knew there would be marks later. He leaned in, his mouth so close to my ear that I could feel his hot breath as he whispered through clenched teeth, "Don't embarrass me. I'm only with you because you're pregnant. Otherwise, I'd be gone. So shut your mouth at this party." I froze. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. His parents kept smiling, unaware of what had just transpired between us. I forced a tight smile back, but inside, something snapped. In that moment, looking at the glittering chandeliers and the perfect facade of the Matthews family celebration, I knew something had to change. The little life growing inside me deserved better than this. I deserved better than this. The revelation didn't come with a clap of thunder or a dramatic scene. It was quiet, like the first snowfall of winter, but just as transformative, just as absolute. As I walked away from the crowd and headed toward the bathroom, my wrists still stinging from Tom's grip, I felt dizzy with emotions I couldn't name. The Westbrooks ladies' room was opulent, with gold fixtures and marble countertops, a stark contrast to the ugliness of what had just happened. I found myself staring at the mirror, hands on the edge of the sink, trying not to cry. His words echoed again and again in my head. "Only with you because you're pregnant." I studied my reflection, barely recognizing the woman looking back at me. My chestnut hair was perfectly styled, my makeup flawless, just as Tom had instructed. But my hazel eyes looked hollow, haunted. The truth was, I'd known things weren't right for a long time. We'd met 3 years ago at a charity gala in Boston. I was working for a nonprofit organization that helped underprivileged children, and he was there representing his law firm. Tom Matthews had been dazzling that night, intelligent, passionate about his work, with a laugh that filled the room. He'd asked for my number, and I'd given it. Without hesitation. Our courtship had been like something out of a movie. Dinners at exclusive restaurants on Newberry Street, weekends in the Cape, flowers delivered to my tiny apartment in Somerville for no reason at all. He used to be charming, attentive, even romantic. He would call me in the middle of the day just to tell me he was thinking about me. Once, he showed up at my office with lunch when I mentioned I was too busy to step out. "You're different," he told me one night as we walked along the Charles River. "Not like the other women I've dated. You care about things that matter." I'd fallen hard and fast, swept away by the promise of a life with someone who seemed to appreciate me for who I was, not what I could offer. 6 months later, we were engaged. A year after that, married in a lavish ceremony at Trinity Church with 500 guests, most of whom I'd never met. The changes were subtle at first. A comment about my clothes, "Don't you think that's a little casual for dinner with the Prescotts?" A suggestion about my job, "Wouldn't you rather work somewhere with more influence?" A remark about my friends, "Melissa seems a bit dramatic, don't you think?" I remembered the first time I saw a flash of the man behind the mask. We were having dinner with his colleagues, and I disagreed with him about a political issue. Nothing major, just a difference of opinion. In the car afterward, he'd been ice cold. "Don't ever contradict me in public again," he'd said, his voice deadly quiet. "It makes me look weak." I'd been shocked, hurt. But the next day, he'd apologized, blamed it on stress from a big case, and taken me to the Museum of Fine Arts, my favorite place in Boston. I forgave him. And I started to be more careful with my words. But that started to change once the pregnancy test came back positive. The bathroom door opened, startling me from my thoughts. It was Jenna, Tom's cousin. "I saw you rush off," she said, her voice laced with concern. "Everything okay?" I nodded automatically, years of conditioning making me hide the truth. But then, looking at her kind face, something gave way. "No," I whispered. "It's not okay. It hasn't been for a long time." Jenna took my hands in hers. "What did he do?" I told her about Tom's whispered threat, the fingerprints forming on my wrist, the months of cutting remarks and controlling behavior. Once I started talking, I couldn't stop. It was like lancing a wound, painful but necessary. "This isn't the first time, is it?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "He resents me now. He says I'm needy, too emotional, not the woman he married. The pregnancy made it worse. It's like he sees the baby as competition." or as another way to control me. Sarah, that's not love. That's abuse. The word hung in the air between us, ugly and undeniable. I'd never allowed myself to think it, let alone say it. Abuse happened to other women, women without resources or education. Not to Sarah Thompson, with her master's degree and supportive parents back in Chicago. I keep thinking about the good days, I admitted, tears finally spilling over. When he'd sing to me in the kitchen while making Sunday breakfast. Or the time he drove an hour just to bring me soup when I had the flu. When my dad had his heart attack last year, Tom arranged for the best cardiologist in Boston to take his case. Those things don't erase the rest, Jenna said gently. They don't make the control and the cruelty okay. I knew she was right. But leaving seemed impossible. We shared a life, a home in Beacon Hill, a baby on the way. And deep down, I was afraid. Not just of Tom, but of admitting failure. Of disappointing people. Of being alone. What would I even do? I whispered, more to myself than to Jenna. You'd live, she answered simply. You'd rebuild. You'd find happiness again, real happiness, not this walking on eggshells half-life. I looked at my reflection again. The woman in the mirror looked terrified but determined. I thought about the baby growing inside me, a little girl we'd learned last month. What would I want for her? Would I want her to stay with a man who treated her the way Tom treated me? The answer was immediate and fierce. Never. I have a guest house, Jenna said, as if reading my thoughts. It's yours if you need it. No strings, no timeline. I squeezed her hand gratefully, then reached for a paper towel to blot my eyes. I should get back before he comes looking for me. Think about what I said, okay? She gave me a quick hug. And whatever you decide, I'm here. I walked back to the banquet hall feeling both shaky and strangely calm. Tom looked up as I approached, his expression a warning. Smile. Act normal. Don't embarrass me. I sat down in my assigned seat, my back straight, my expression carefully neutral. That was when I made a decision. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew I couldn't let this night go by without reclaiming a part of myself. I rubbed my belly beneath the tablecloth, feeling my daughter shift and kick, strong and alive. I whispered so softly that no one could hear, I won't let you grow up thinking this is love. The words felt like a promise, a lifeline thrown to my future self. And for the first time in months, I felt something like hope. As the evening went on, the atmosphere turned even more celebratory. The five-piece jazz ensemble had switched to classic love songs, and couples swayed on the dance floor beneath the crystal chandeliers. Servers in crisp black uniforms circulated with trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. The Matthews family friends clinked glasses, shared laughs, and reminisced about decades of shared memories. I sat at the head table, nursing a glass of sparkling water, watching Tom charm everyone around him. He was good at that, presenting the perfect facade to the world. Successful attorney. Devoted son. Husband and father-to-be. No one would ever guess what he had whispered to me just an hour earlier. The MC, a longtime friend of Tom's parents, tapped the microphone, signaling the start of the evening's speeches. A hush fell over the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, we're gathered here tonight to celebrate a remarkable achievement, 50 years of marriage between Richard and Elizabeth Matthews. In today's world, that kind of commitment deserves recognition. There was enthusiastic applause. I clapped too, watching Elizabeth lean into Richard's shoulder with practiced affection. 50 years. I couldn't imagine 50 more minutes with Tom, let alone years. Richard stood first, straightening his bow tie as he approached the microphone. At 75, he still cut an imposing figure, tall and distinguished, with silver hair and the same penetrating blue eyes as his son. When I met Elizabeth at Radcliffe in 1968, I knew she was special, he began. She was the smartest person in our economics seminar and the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. It took me 3 months to work up the courage to ask her for coffee. Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. Elizabeth blushed prettily. Richard continued, his voice growing emotional as he reminisced about their first home, a modest apartment in Cambridge while he attended Harvard Law, their early struggles, the birth of their children. He spoke about weathering difficult times together, the loss of their first child, a stillborn son before Tom was born, the year Elizabeth was diagnosed with breast cancer, the economic downturn that nearly cost them their investment firm. But through it all, we faced each day as partners, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Equal partners who respected each other even when we disagreed, who lifted each other up instead of tearing each other down. That's the secret, if there is one. Love is essential, but respect, that's the foundation that keeps love standing through the storms. His mother's eyes filled with tears. Everyone clapped. I felt a lump in my throat, thinking about how different their marriage seemed from the one I was living. The MC announced that it was time for family members to speak, children, in-laws, grandchildren. Tom's sister Margaret went first, sharing funny stories about growing up with parents who set the bar impossibly high for what marriage should be. Her husband followed, then Tom's aunt and uncle from Philadelphia. When it was our turn, Tom stood up and gestured for me to stay seated. "I'll speak for both of us," he said, his tone light but his eyes warning me not to challenge him. He stepped to the microphone, all Cambridge charm and polished charisma. What can I say about my parents that hasn't already been said? They've been my North Star, my example of what commitment looks like. Dad showed me what it means to be a provider, a protector, a man who puts family first. Mom taught me to expect the best from myself and others. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. I'm honored to carry on their legacy, especially now as Sarah and I prepare to welcome the next generation of Matthews. I smiled politely, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Inside, I felt the fire rise. No, not tonight. Not anymore. When he sat back down beside me, I squeezed his hand, a gesture that to onlookers would seem affectionate, but that I knew would confuse him. Beautiful speech, I whispered. He looked momentarily pleased, then suspicious. Thanks, he muttered. When the MC asked if anyone else would like to share a few words, I stood up, slowly and deliberately. Tom's hand shot out to grab my wrist, but I was already moving away from the table. Sit down, he hissed. What are you doing? I didn't answer. I walked to the microphone with measured steps, conscious of all eyes turning toward me. There was a curious hush. I wasn't known for making speeches or drawing attention to myself at family gatherings. In fact, I'd become quite skilled at fading into the background. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. But then I caught Jenna's eye from across the room. She gave me a subtle nod of encouragement. I took a deep breath and glanced down at my belly, thinking of my daughter, thinking of the world I wanted her to grow up in. A world where her mother had courage. I know I wasn't expected to speak, I began, my voice trembling slightly before finding its strength. But I feel it would be wrong to let this night go without a bit of honesty. After all, 50 years of marriage deserves nothing less than truth. I saw Tom's face freeze across the room. His mother smiled at me encouragingly, clearly expecting some sweet anecdote or compliment. I looked at her, and that gave me a strange sort of strength. She had raised her son to be the man he was, for better or worse. But maybe she didn't know who he had become. I've always admired your love story, Elizabeth and Richard. The way you described your partnership tonight, Richard, that's what marriage should be. Equal partners who respect each other, who lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. I paused, finding my rhythm. And maybe that's why I stayed quiet for so long, hoping ours would look like yours one day. The room was utterly still now, people leaning forward in their seats. Tom's face had gone from frozen to livid. He started to rise from his chair, but his father put a restraining hand on his arm. But tonight, I was reminded that love without respect isn't love at all. My voice grew stronger with each word. Your son told me, not an hour ago, that he's only still with me because I'm pregnant. That if I weren't carrying his child, he would have left me. I held up my wrist, where the red marks of his fingers were still visible. This is what happened when I made a harmless joke about him trying to cook dinner for me once. This is what happens behind closed doors every day. There was a collective intake of breath. Tom finally broke free of his father's grip and stood up, his face contorted with rage. Sarah, that's enough, he snarled. You're embarrassing yourself. No, Tom. For once, I'm not embarrassing myself. I'm standing up for myself. I turned back to the crowd, to the sea of shocked faces. I'm not saying this for pity. I'm saying this because tonight, hearing Richard talk about respect being the foundation of marriage, I realized how broken ours is. And I won't let my daughter grow up thinking this kind of relationship is what she should expect or accept. I looked directly at Elizabeth, whose hand was pressed against her mouth. Your son is charming in public, attentive when others are watching. But at home, he's someone else entirely. Someone who belittles, controls, and intimidates. I've made excuses for too long. I've hidden the truth out of shame, out of fear. But I'm done being afraid. My voice cracked then, but I pushed on. I deserve more than this. My daughter deserves more. We all do. And maybe if more women spoke up, fewer of us would stay silent this long. I stepped back from the microphone, suddenly aware of what I had done. The enormity of it washed over me. The public revelation, the burning of bridges, the point of no return. But alongside the fear was something else, relief. The crushing weight of secrecy and shame had lifted. Whatever came next, I would face it honestly. As I walked back toward the table, my legs surprisingly steady, I saw Tom's mother rise slowly from her seat. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. The room fell into a stunned silence. I could almost hear the heartbeats of 200 people as my words hung in the air. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching into eternity as I watched my truth land like sharp stones tossed into still water. Some guests gasped. Others exchanged glances of shock or discomfort. A few older women nodded slightly, their eyes meeting mine with quiet understanding. The waitstaff froze in place, champagne bottles tilted mid-pour, unsure whether to continue their duties or retreat to the kitchen. Elizabeth Matthews stared at me, her perfectly manicured hand still pressed against her mouth. Richard sat rigid beside her, his expression unreadable. Tom's sister Margaret looked from me to her brother, her face a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. The silence lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it felt like an hour. Then Tom jumped to his feet, nearly knocking over his chair in the process. His face had turned an alarming shade of red, veins bulging at his temples. I'd seen that look before, in the privacy of our home, but never in public. She's hormonal, he barked, waving his hands as if dismissing a child's tantrum. Completely unstable right now. You know how pregnancy is. The doctor said she might have these episodes. He forced a laugh, glancing around the room for support, his lawyer's instinct to control the narrative kicking in. Sarah, honey, let's get you home. You're clearly not feeling well. He started toward me, his smile fixed and false, but his eyes burning with a fury I knew would erupt the moment we were alone. I took an instinctive step back. I'm not hormonal, Tom, I said quietly but firmly. I'm telling the truth. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone coughed awkwardly. A woman I didn't recognize whispered something to her companion. Richard, Tom appealed to his father, his voice strained with forced calm. A little help here? Clearly, this isn't the time or place for whatever this is. Richard Matthews slowly rose to his feet. He was an imposing figure, a patriarch used to commanding respect in boardrooms and courtrooms alike. The room hushed again, waiting. Tom smirked, confident in his father's backup. Thomas, Richard began, his voice measured. Is what Sarah said true? Did you tell your pregnant wife you're only with her because of the baby? Tom's smirk faltered. Dad, come on. Of course not. She's twisting things. You know how women can be when they're... Answer the question. Richard cut him off sharply. Yes or no? Did you say those words to Sarah tonight? Tom's eyes darted around the room, calculation visible on his face. I might have said something in the heat of the moment. We had a little disagreement, that's all. Nothing serious. Certainly nothing that warranted this public spectacle. I held up my wrist again, where the marks of his fingers were deepening to purple. And this? Was this just the heat of the moment, too? Elizabeth rose slowly from her seat. Did he really say that to you? She asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. And did he? Did he hurt you? I nodded, surprised to find I was no longer afraid. Yes, to both. Her face paled. Then, in one swift motion, she picked up her wine glass and threw it across the table. Red wine splashed onto Tom's crisp white shirt and designer suit. The glass shattered against the wall behind him. "How dare you," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "How dare you treat your wife that way? How dare you bring that behavior into this family?" A collective gasp went up from the crowd. No one had ever seen Elizabeth Matthews lose her composure, least of all at her own anniversary celebration. But she wasn't finished. 50 years, she continued, her voice rising. 50 years I've spent building a family based on mutual respect. I will not, her voice broke slightly, I will not stand by while my son disgraces everything his father and I taught him. Tom looked stunned. Mother, you can't possibly be taking her side. She's clearly— Margaret stood up then, her eyes blazing. Clearly what, Tom? Clearly brave enough to tell the truth? Is that why you told me not to visit them last month? Because you didn't want me to see how you really treat her. This is absurd, Tom sputtered, looking around for allies. But the mood of the room had shifted. His sister followed her mother's example, picking up a glass of water and throwing it at him. That's for all the times you probably made her cry, she said. His Aunt Judith, Elizabeth's sister from Connecticut, stood up next. I always thought there was something off about how quiet Sarah became after the wedding. You're just like your grandfather, Thomas. A charmer in public, a tyrant at home. She too launched her drink at him, a cosmopolitan that left a trailing splash of cranberry across his chest. The room had transformed from shocked silence to chaotic noise in minutes. People were standing, voices raised, some defending Tom, others condemning him, still others simply trying to understand what was happening. Tom stood drenched and humiliated, wine and water dripping from his once immaculate suit, still muttering excuses and denials. His once supportive family had turned into a furious crowd, throwing shame at him louder than I ever could. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to find Jenna beside me. Let's get you out of here, she said gently. You've done enough. You don't need to see the rest of this. But I couldn't move yet. I was transfixed by the scene unfolding before me, the public disintegration of the facade Tom had so carefully constructed. Years of suppressed anger and pain were flowing out of me, leaving me strangely calm in the midst of the storm. Richard Matthews made his way through the crowd to where I stood. The room quieted slightly as he approached, respect for the family patriarch momentarily overriding the chaos. He looked older suddenly, the weight of the evening's revelations visible in the slump of his shoulders. Sarah, he said, his voice carrying easily despite its lowered volume. I want to apologize to you. Not just for tonight, but for all of it. No Matthews man should ever treat a woman the way my son has treated you. He turned to face the crowd, his eyes finding Tom in the sea of faces. And Thomas, I want you to know that you will answer for this. To your family and to the law if necessary. Tom's face contorted with rage. You're all insane, he shouted. All of you. Taking the word of a hysterical pregnant woman over your own flesh and blood. I'm done with this farce. He stormed toward the exit, shouldering past guests who quickly stepped out of his way. At the door, he turned back, his eyes finding me in the crowd. This isn't over, Sarah, he called, his voice slurred with anger. You've made the biggest mistake of your life. Then he was gone, leaving behind a room full of stunned guests and a family in turmoil. I placed a protective hand over my belly, feeling the baby kick as if in response to the chaos. It is over, I whispered, too softly for anyone to hear. It ended the moment I decided to speak. After Tom stormed out, the anniversary party dissolved into clusters of hushed conversations. The jazz quartet packed up their instruments. The waitstaff cleared plates with awkward efficiency. Some guests made discreet exits, murmuring polite goodbyes to Richard and Elizabeth. Others lingered, too fascinated by the family drama to leave. I stood in a daze, surrounded by a protective circle of Tom's female relatives. His cousin Jenna kept her arm around my shoulders. His Aunt Judith pressed a glass of water into my hands. His sister Margaret alternated between apologizing to me and cursing her brother under her breath. I should have seen it, Margaret kept saying. All those times you canceled lunch plans. The way you stopped talking at family gatherings. God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. You couldn't have known, I assured her, though part of me wished someone had noticed sooner. He was careful. It was always behind closed doors. That's how abusers operate, Jenna said, her doctor's voice clinical but kind. They isolate. They control the narrative. They make you doubt yourself. The word still felt strange to me, abuser. In my mind, abusers were monstrous men who beat their wives bloody, not successful attorneys who graduated from Harvard Law. Not charming men who could quote Shakespeare and knew which wine paired best with salmon. Not my husband. But then I looked down at my wrist, where the bruises from his fingers were darkening, and I knew Jenna was right. The marks on my skin were just the visible evidence of the invisible wounds he'd inflicted for years. Elizabeth Matthews approached, her elegant composure reassembled despite the chaos of the evening. Only the slight tremble in her hands betrayed her distress. Sarah, she said, her voice steady. I'd like to speak with you privately, if that's all right. The protective circle parted reluctantly, and Elizabeth led me to a small sitting room adjacent to the main hall. It was quieter here, the sounds of the disintegrating party muffled by heavy oak doors. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, casting warm light over leather armchairs and bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes. Elizabeth sat down and gestured for me to do the same. Up close, I could see the fine lines around her eyes, the subtle age spots on her hands that her expensive creams couldn't quite erase. She suddenly seemed very human, very vulnerable, not the intimidating society matriarch I'd always known. I need to know everything, she said simply. Not just tonight. All of it. So I told her. About the early days when Tom was attentive and loving. About the gradual shift after our wedding, the criticism that started as helpful suggestions but evolved into constant fault-finding. The isolation from my friends and family in Chicago. The control over our finances, despite my own career and income. The monitoring of my phone and email for my safety. The accusations of flirting if I so much as smiled at a waiter. The threats that became more frequent after my pregnancy. Elizabeth listened without interrupting, her face growing grimmer with each revelation. When I finally fell silent, she reached out and took my hands in hers. I failed you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I failed as a mother-in-law and as a woman. I should have seen what was happening. He fooled everyone, I said. Even me, for a long time. She shook her head. No, I saw the signs. The way he spoke to you sometimes. How you'd flinch if he moved too quickly. But I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. That all marriages have their difficulties. She squeezed my hands. My own mother told me the same thing when Richard's father was harsh with his wife. It was a different generation, but the excuses remain the same, don't they? I nodded, surprised by her candor. Richard and I will help you, she continued. Whatever you need, lawyers, security, a place to stay. Your family, Sarah. You and the baby. Thank you, I managed, overwhelmed by the unexpected support. But I don't want to cause any more pain for your family. This night was supposed to be about celebrating your marriage, not exposing the failure of mine. Elizabeth's expression hardened. You didn't ruin anything. Thomas did that all on his own. And it's high time he faced consequences for his actions. She straightened her shoulders. The Matthews name means something in the city. It opens doors. But it also comes with responsibilities. Thomas forgot that. Or perhaps we never taught him properly. There was a soft knock at the door, and Richard entered, his face lined with worry. The car service is here if you're ready to leave, Elizabeth. He nodded to me. Sarah, Jenna tells me you'll be staying with her tonight. Is that what you want? Yes, I said, feeling certainty settle over me like a warm blanket. I can't go back to the house. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. Richard nodded. I've called Kevin Sullivan. He's the best divorce attorney in Massachusetts. He'll meet with you tomorrow morning. Richard, I protested weakly. You don't have to. Yes, I do, he interrupted firmly. My son married you. He made vows to you. His behavior isn't just a betrayal of you, it's a betrayal of the values this family has stood for across generations. We will set this right, Sarah. Whatever it takes. As we walked back into the main hall, I was astonished to see how many people had stayed. Tom's childhood friend Michael approached, his expression solemn. "I should have said something years ago," he said without preamble. "In law school, the way he'd talk about women sometimes. I knew his views were messed up, but I never thought he'd actually." He trailed off, then straightened his shoulders. "I have text messages. From Tom. Things he said about you, about controlling you. If you need them for the divorce, they're yours." Before I could respond, his law firm colleague Dana stepped forward. "He's been having an affair with his paralegal," she said bluntly. "For at least a year. I have proof of that too." One by one, people approached, offering evidence, support, shelter, legal advice. People who had witnessed small moments of cruelty but had dismissed them. People who had suspected something was wrong but hadn't wanted to interfere. People who had their own stories of Tom's darker side. Tom had tried to control the narrative for years, portraying himself as the perfect husband, me as the unstable wife. He'd crafted his public persona with the precision of a master architect. But now that I'd cracked the foundation, the entire structure was collapsing. His father came up to me quietly, eyes heavy with sadness. "I didn't raise him to treat a woman like that," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I'd shown him what it meant to be a good man, a good husband. Somewhere along the way, I failed him, and by extension, I failed you. You don't have to go through this alone." That nearly broke me. The kindness was somehow harder to bear than the cruelty had been. I'd come thinking I was isolated, but I was met with solidarity from the most unexpected places. Jenna appeared at my side with my coat and purse. "Ready to go?" she asked gently. "My guest house is all set up for you." I nodded, suddenly bone-tired. The adrenaline of the evening was wearing off, leaving me shaky and drained. As we walked toward the exit, Elizabeth called after me. "Sarah." I turned back. "What you did tonight took immense courage," she said. "Thank you for showing us the truth, however painful it might be." Outside, the November air was crisp and clean, the Boston skyline twinkling against the night sky. As I slid into the passenger seat of Jenna's Volvo, I felt a sudden, powerful kick from my daughter. "I know, little one," I whispered, placing my hand over the spot. "Everything's going to be different now. For both of us." A week after the party, I sat across from Kevin Sullivan in his corner office overlooking Boston Common. The trees were bare now, their skeletal branches reaching toward a steel-gray sky. Winter was coming, but inside I felt the first tentative stirrings of spring. "These terms are extremely favorable," Kevin said, sliding the preliminary divorce agreement across his mahogany desk. "Full ownership of the Beacon Hill property, substantial alimony, child support well above the standard calculation. Thomas is essentially giving you everything." I stared at the papers, the legal language swimming before my eyes. "Why? This doesn't seem like Tom." Kevin smiled grimly. "Let's just say the Matthews family has significant influence. And Richard was quite persuasive during our meeting with Thomas and his attorney." I thought about the past week, the whirlwind of change that had followed my moment of truth at the anniversary party. Jenna's guest house in Brookline had become my sanctuary, a peaceful cottage at the back of her property where I could breathe freely for the first time in years. I'd slept through the night without waking in fear. I'd eaten meals without criticism about my choices. I'd spoken my mind without calculating the potential backlash. "There's something else you should know," Kevin continued, his expression serious. "Thomas violated the temporary restraining order yesterday. He went to your office looking for you." My stomach clenched. "Did he security stopped him before he could get to your floor?" "He was intoxicated. Belligerent. There are witnesses, security footage. It only strengthens our case." Kevin leaned forward. "Sarah, I want you to consider a more permanent protective order. This pattern of behavior, the control, the threatening language at the party, now this violation, it's concerning." I nodded, cradling my belly. At 7 months, my daughter was more active than ever, rolling and kicking as if impatient to join the world. Every decision I made now was for both of us. Do whatever you think is best, I said. I trust your judgment. After signing the preliminary papers, I walked through Boston Common, needing time to process everything. The divorce wasn't finalized yet, but the trajectory was clear. I was reclaiming my life piece by piece. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret, Tom's sister. Lunch next week? I miss you. And I want to help with the nursery when you're ready. Another message followed, this one from Elizabeth. Richard and I would like to set up a trust fund for our granddaughter. No strings attached. She's family, no matter what. I smiled, touched by their continued support. When I'd walked into that anniversary party, I'd been so certain I would lose everything: Tom's family, our shared friends, my sense of security. Instead, I'd gained something unexpected: authenticity. Truth had burned some bridges, but strengthened others. As I neared the frog pond, I spotted a familiar figure on a bench: Tom's father, Richard. He was feeding the ducks, tossing pieces of bread into the water with a contemplative expression. He looked up as I approached, his face lighting with recognition. Sarah, what a pleasant surprise. He patted the bench beside him. Join me? I hesitated, then sat down. We hadn't spoken much since the night of the party, most of our communication happening through lawyers and intermediaries. Kevin told me about the agreement, I said. Thank you for whatever you did to make that happen. Richard sighed heavily. I simply reminded Thomas of certain realities. The family's reputation, his position at the firm, the consequences of a messy, public divorce given the circumstances. He paused, gazing out over the pond. And I reminded him that a real man takes responsibility for his actions. We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the ducks glide across the water's surface. He's agreed to therapy, Richard said finally. Not just as a condition of the divorce settlement, but because I made it clear his relationship with his mother and me depends on it. He turned to look at me directly. I don't expect you to forgive him, Sarah. I wouldn't ask that of you. But I want you to know we're not abandoning him, despite our anger and disappointment. We're trying to help him become the man we thought we'd raised. I hope it works, I said sincerely. Not for my sake, but for his. And for our daughter. Richard smiled sadly. You're a remarkable woman, Sarah Thompson. My son never deserved you. 2 days later, Tom tried to beg his way back into my life. He showed up at Jenna's front door with flowers, tears, and promises of change. When she refused to let him see me, he became enraged, threatening to fight for full custody of his child. The police were called. Another violation added to the record. The next day, he sent a different kind of message, a lengthy email alternating between self-pity and veiled threats. He blamed me for destroying our family and turning everyone against him. He claimed I'd planned the whole thing, manipulated his parents, exaggerated his behavior for sympathy. I forwarded it to Kevin without response. A week later, Tom left town. His law firm had suggested a transfer to their Seattle office, a move orchestrated by Richard, I suspected. Tom refused therapy, blamed me one final time. In a scathing voicemail, and eventually, he was gone. I didn't stop him. I felt no triumph in his departure, only relief tinged with sadness for what might have been. The man I'd fallen in love with years ago had been real, I believed. But somewhere along the way, control had replaced love, possession had replaced partnership, and we'd both lost ourselves in the process. When spring arrived, I moved back into our Beacon Hill brownstone, now my brownstone. I repainted every room, replacing the cold grays and sterile whites Tom had insisted upon with warm, vibrant colors. I rehung artwork he'd deemed too bohemian and filled vases with flowers he'd called impractical. Margaret and Jenna helped me prepare the nursery, painting clouds on the ceiling and filling bookshelves with stories about brave girls and women. Elizabeth knitted blankets and tiny sweaters. Richard assembled furniture and installed safety features throughout the house. My parents flew in from Chicago, relieved to finally reconnect after years of Tom's subtle interference in our relationship. My mother cried when she saw my growing belly, apologizing again and again for not recognizing what was happening, for not finding a way to help sooner. "It wasn't your fault," I told her, the words I'd repeated to so many people. He was careful, and I was ashamed to admit the truth. On a bright May morning, Lily Elizabeth Thompson entered the world after 20 hours of labor. She had my dark hair, Tom's blue eyes, and lungs that announced her arrival with impressive volume. Jenna cut the cord. My mother held her first. Tom's family arrived with gifts and tears and promises of support. Tom was not there. He had not responded to the notification of his daughter's birth. His absence was a wound, but not a fatal one. We would heal without him. Now, every morning, I wake up to Lily's coos through the baby monitor. I feed her as sunrise paints my bedroom gold. I show her pictures of her father and tell her simple truths. He loved me once. I loved him too. Sometimes people can't stay together, even when there's a baby. But you are loved by so many people. I look at her perfect face and feel peace. Not because everything's perfect. Raising a child alone is harder than I ever imagined. Not because the memories of those dark years have faded, they still surface in nightmares that leave me gasping. Not because I've fully healed. Some days I still doubt myself, second-guess decisions, hear Tom's critical voice in my head. But I feel peace because I chose self-respect over silence. I stood up, even when my knees were shaking. I shattered the facade of perfection to reveal the painful truth beneath, and in doing so, I found something stronger than the love I thought I'd lost: courage. If Lily ever asks why she doesn't have a dad in her life, I'll tell her, because we both deserved better. And we found it in ourselves and in the family we chose. Last week, I received a letter from Tom, the first communication in nearly a year. Inside was a check for an amount far exceeding his required child support and a brief note: "I'm sorry. I'm getting help. Maybe someday I can be the father she deserves." I put the check in Lily's college fund and tucked the note into her baby book. Whether he becomes part of her life someday is a bridge we'll cross when we reach it. For now, we're building our own story, one day at a time. Yesterday, I submitted my application to law school, something Tom had discouraged whenever I'd mentioned it. "Harvard seems like a reach for someone with your background," he used to say. But Richard pulled some strings, wrote a recommendation, and believes I have an excellent chance of admission. Life didn't end the way I imagined when I walked into that anniversary party last November. It didn't end at all. Instead, it began anew, messier than the perfect existence I'd pretended to have, but infinitely more authentic. There are days when I still feel fragile, when the reality of single motherhood overwhelms me, when I wonder if I'll ever trust enough to love again. But then Lily smiles, or Elizabeth calls to check in, or Jenna stops by with coffee and conversation, and I remember, freedom isn't the absence of challenges. It's the ability to face them on your own terms, with your head held high and your voice unsilenced. It's the power to tell your story, not the sanitized version someone else demands, but the raw, honest truth. And in that telling, to reclaim the narrative of your life.